Um, so I'd like to thank the Jaipur Literature Festival for having us and also for their very interesting notes, which I think express very well the way that we imagine the Mauryas today. They are considered by many to have been the first Indian empire. They're considered to have had an extraordinary bureaucracy, to have spread Buddhism to the farthest corners of the earth. And what we'll be doing over the course of the next 45 minutes or so is really getting into what we really know about the Mauryas and whether the picture that the evidence tells us is the same as what we like to believe about them. So to begin with, let's actually talk about what was happening before the Mauryas. I tend to think that very often, very few of us know really what was happening in the Gangetic plains leading up to them. We know there's this absolute pell-mell of kingdoms. We've heard of Buddha and Mahavir and all these very saintly people doing saintly things before that. But I think the archaeological picture, in terms of the actual evidence, reveals a absolutely fascinating phenomenon. Suresh, could you tell us a little more about in our conversations leading up to this? You called it Gangetization, which I found so interesting. What really does the archaeological picture tell us about the lead up to the Mauryas in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE?
Thank you, Anirudh. I think I'll get started by saying that empire is a process. It's not a fossilized state. And the Mauryas don't appear on the scene overnight. There's a long imperial process that underpins the Mauryan state, in particular the Nandas that preceded them. But this process really goes back all the way to Bimbisara and Ajatashatru, who were contemporaries of the Buddha. And the polity of Magadha is central to this. So if we look at the Bairat inscription of Ashoka, so Bairat is a Buddhist site that's only 2 hours away from Jaipur. If you haven't already seen it, you should go there. And Ashoka at that inscription tells us that he is the king of Magadha, Raja Magade. That's what he tells us, right? That's how he self-identifies, as the king of Magadha. So that polity of Magadha and the king identifying himself with it is important. The Mauryan Empire is basically an anachronism. They don't call themselves the Mauryan Empire as such. They still, harken back to the Magadha forebears. Whether they were actually related by blood to the earlier dynasties doesn't seem to be so clear. We actually don't have a lot of evidence about how they might be related to the Nandas and what sort of processes led the Mauryas into power in the first place. And just to pick up very briefly on the archaeology, the archaeology of the periphery in particular is interesting, as Namita Sugandhi has shown with her study of Tekkalakota in Karnataka. There doesn't seem to be much evidence on the ground for the Mauryans per se. But this might tell us that the model of an empire was flexible. Perhaps it was a situation they were co-opting local elites, which might lead to the fact that we don't have much material evidence for the Mauryans beyond these edicts that we see and that are so well known.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's a really interesting point that you made. When we think about history, very often we think about the great men, the flashy, glorious conquerors and so on. But sometimes the reality of historical change can be a little more mundane. It can be about the long-term transformation of material cultures, about the circulation of ideas and the emergence of these new kinds of deeper political formations that aren't just about the big men on top. But with all that said, there are some big men at the very top of the Mauryan Empire. And perhaps the most famous of them, perhaps the second most famous of them, let me correct myself, is Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Mauryan Empire. My colleague Sushma here has written a fantastic book about who Chandragupta was and the rather fragmentary evidence that was used to construct an image of who he was in the 20th century. So if you could tell us a little bit about the founder of the empire, Sushma, and he must have been a rather interesting person, a real force of nature to have established a polity that extended its way across the entire Gangetic plains. But what kind of actual historical footprint did this person leave in the record?
Thank you so much for asking me that, because we all, I'm sure, think we know a lot about all of these ancient rulers. We must think, oh, this great person, what an extraordinary person, what an interesting life, and he, traveled to all these places, and this was his family. But actually, when you really get down to it, you know virtually nothing. And in fact, the earliest sources for Chandragupta, they're not even from they're not South Asian. They're actually from the Greco-Roman tradition. And some of the contemporary material that we have is from Megasthenes. I'm quite a big fan of Megasthenes. He was the first Greek ambassador to travel to India, crossing the Indus and into the Gangetic Valley. And he probably was the ambassador of Seleucus, who's one of Alexander's generals, and he wrote an ethnography in 4 books, and we have some little fragments of that remaining. And all of a sudden, that's where, very tantalizingly, there are some references to Chandragupta's court, and it's not necessarily what you would expect. There's some references to golden dishes and things, of course, but then there's also references to Chandragupta's female bodyguards, and that's probably really unexpected. So you have that, and then you have this huge lacuna until you get to, say, Hemachandra, the Jain scholarly monk in Gujarat, and he tells us some stories, but the sources that he was drawing on, we have absolutely no idea. Was it an oral tradition? Was it a written tradition? We don't know. And then, I know this is something you want to talk about a bit later, but in the Sri Lankan chronicle tradition, virtually the same story is found there as well. So something's clearly circulating. But once again, that's written about 800 years later than the time when Chandragupta lived. So you talk about the historical footprint. It's a great question, because actually, we know very, very, very little indeed, and the rest you slowly piece together from partly your imagination. As ancient historians, you do have to use your imagination a bit, and just little fragments from all these other little sources. And I think most of the South Asian sources tend to be in conjunction with Ashoka, and so obviously they tend to be Buddhist in nature too, or obviously Jain as well. So anyway, yeah, that's basically the footprint of Chandragupta, which is, as you can tell, really, really limited.
That's a really fascinating point, is because I feel like the Mauryas play such a major role in our imagination of India as a nation. The idea that they're an Indian empire, the first Indian empire, the first of many, and that in many ways, the regional kingdoms that characterize most of the subcontinent's history are an aberration from the original template established by the Mauryas. But as both Suresh and you have said, we don't really know a lot about the ostensible founder of this first Indian empire, and more importantly, they didn't consider themselves emperors of India, but emperors of Magadha, who then dominated the surrounding regions. Now let's move on to the next of the big men, a man who is, once again, like Chandragupta, known primarily from Greco-Roman sources, but isn't very often addressed, his son Bindusara. Could you tell us a little bit about him, Devika?
For every character who's known in history, there are several others who fall into the cracks and who aren't known. And historians are actually notoriously selective when they tell you the narrative of the past. So Bindusara is someone who suffers the unfortunate fate of being sandwiched between his very enigmatic and mysterious father Chandragupta, who's caught the popular imagination in a lot of ways, and his very illustrious son Ashoka, who became possibly one of the best known monarchs in the world. He also is routinely mixed up with Bimbisara, of 6th century Magadha. And I think those of you who've been through the Indian school system would probably have lost marks in your exams when you mention one for the other. There are very few sources, for him, Bindusara. The Buddhist sources are not too happy about him. They provide scanty details because he is known to have also patronized the Ajivika sect. And so they're a little sparse on those details about him. You have Greco-Roman sources who do mention him, for which he's actually got into trouble with modern-day historians, because he is actually supposed to have been quite a remarkable man with an interest in lands beyond his ken. He's supposed to have had diplomatic relations with, the Seleucid Empire, and asked the king to send him figs and wine, for which modern-day historians have said, useless king, he's fooling around with figs and wine when he should have been ruling. But the fact is that Ashoka inherited an enormous realm, which means that his father obviously had excellent control over it. We also have Tamil sources that talk about the Mauryan, armies during Bindusara's time, cutting across the landscape, We have a Tibetan source, Taranath's History of Buddhism, that talks about Kautilya, who was Chandragupta's mentor, having made Bindusara the lord of the lands between the east and the west. Putting all these things together, we have this really enigmatic, elusive character who cannot be ignored because Ashoka, his illustrious son, obviously was sitting on the shoulders of these two giants before him. So we actually need to pay a lot of attention to this man who came in between.
I think you raise a very interesting point, which is the fact that the Mauryans had this curiosity about the world beyond them. And we don't know to what extent kings before them had or did not have that curiosity. But for the Mauryans, it's attested. We have Greek sources who mention them by name. And I think that there have been excavations in Pataliputra, Patna, the former Mauryan capital, which threw up these fascinating pillar capitals that look very much like models that we see in Persepolis, which was the capital of Persia at the time. And to me, that suggests something quite interesting. To take a bit of a tangent into a much later time and place, if you were to think of how Southeast Asian kings in the early medieval period pick up what we would imagine as elements of Indian kingship, it seems that the Mauryas are also trying to do something similar in terms of picking up elements of what they think are global kingship. There's a particular language of international power, the way that monarchs are imagined, that they're trying to bring to life. But of course, they do something very different with power as well, as Ashoka Maurya proves. Perhaps the single most famous of the Mauryan monarchs, who seems to formulate a radically new notion of Indian kingship, that's based on Buddhist principles, and then leaves these edicts apparently scattered across the entire Indian subcontinent. And that's something that I'd like to explore from multiple angles as we move into the next stage of our discussion, which is, first of all, let's ask you, Devika, what do the edicts say? What are the most interesting and weirdest glimpses you've caught of Ashoka's personality from looking at his edicts?
So Ashoka was a rather interesting mercurial personality. If we are to go by the stories, prone to fits of violence and then suddenly having this massive spiritual transformation after he won the Battle of Kalinga. And what is most remarkable about his edicts is he actually records what he terms as his failure to understand the scale of devastation that he himself had unleashed while winning this battle. So I think that sets him apart immediately because, normally military triumphs are what is recorded, in ancient records. But here he's recording, he's lamenting his victory and then decides to embark on a path of peace. And that is actually the only known evidence for Kalinga because the Buddhist sources do not mention this war at all. But what is also very interesting in his edicts, Anirudh, is the fact that, yes, he is lamenting and he's saying, I'm not going to fight wars anymore, I'm going to conquer through Dhamma, which is his ideology of religious, ethical governance. But in one of his edicts, he very sternly gives a rap on the knuckles to potentially troublesome elements, the tribal elements, and he says, he's basically saying, do not mistake my newfound pacifism for military weakness. Because he warns them. He says, I do have the power to keep you in line. So that I found really interesting. He also has a very interesting animal welfare package that he announces in a couple of his edicts, talking about provision of medicine and water for them, and these injunctions about not killing them, not harming them, and so on and so forth. So that's interesting. Yes, he also does criticize women to some extent for observing all these rituals that waste a lot of money, and when the men of their households are leaving on some journey or at the time of birth or death or whatever. But he basically pours his heart and soul into his messages. And we must remember that this was a time when we didn't have modern tools of replication, available. So he was actually pioneering this amazing method of communication with the subjects of his vast realm by pouring his heart and soul onto durable surfaces, pillars and rocks all over his kingdom, and also ensuring that he's known throughout posterity as well, because they're still around today. And I think that was also part of what was at the back of his mind.
So that brings up a bunch of interesting questions to my mind. Now, yes, Ashoka is pouring out his heart and soul, but was his bureaucracy, for lack of a better word, whoever are the folks who are running the Mauryan Empire, are they capable of really doing the things that Ashoka says that he wants them to? Are they capable of ensuring animal welfare? Are they capable of preventing people from hunting animals to feed themselves? Are they capable of going into every household and finding women who are performing these rituals that Ashoka disapproves of? What did the Mauryan state actually look like? Any of you can weigh in.
Okay, so there's always this problem, perennial problem of historical reconstruction, which is this gap between theory and practice. Ashoka does say that because of his newfound piety, the people of his kingdom are very happy and there's joy spreading everywhere and evil is diminishing.
That sounds a lot like modern politicians.
But it doesn't mean that the hunters and fishermen stopped hunting and fishing and lived on love and fresh air alone. Obviously, maybe there was a diminishing of violence towards animals, but grandiose claims need not always be accepted in their entirety. So we need to inject a modicum of practicality here and sort of weigh one against the other.
Suresh, what does the archaeology tell us, and what do non-Ashokan sources say about the Mauryan Empire?
I mean, just to pick up on what Devika said, the Ashokan inscriptions do give you a sense of the administrative structure of, you have the Mahamatras, and above them the Kumaras, in the viceregal centers, presumably royal princes. So in the south, the prince, who is called an Aryaputra in one of these inscriptions, is installed in a town called Suvarnagiri. But again, we don't know so much about these places. We haven't even identified Suvarnagiri properly on the ground. It has been identified with various sites with Ashokan pillar inscriptions. But to look at this process, especially power in the periphery, from a different set of sources, I turn to the Sangam Tamil sources, which Devika has already alluded to. They're interesting in the sense that they are the only sort of southern sources to give us a native, if I were to use that term, perspective on the Mauryans. We don't quite know if they're contemporary of the Mauryans. They might be a few generations removed, but even then they give us a strong sense of historical memory that's preserved in that particular tradition that dates between 300 BCE to around 300 CE. Now, in these sources, the Mauryans are presented as a threatening force. One of these poets, Mamulanar, describes them as Vamba Maurya, the troublesome, the quarrelsome Mauryas. But the same word could also mean upstart. So it's definitely not a positive adjective in any way. And it's interesting that they often appear together with their proxies, two groups of people who are called the Kosar and the Vadugar. Now, there are two ways in which we can interpret this. The Mauryans are using proxies to govern their frontier regions, like these Kosar and Vadugar peoples. Alternatively, the proxies are in sort of drawing their overlords to prosecute their own wars, right? So it's not necessarily a case of the Mauryans consciously expanding, but peoples on the periphery are sort of using Mauryan power for their own projects.
See, I just find that to be such a fascinating interpretation of the evidence, because I think very often we think about empires and conquests and so on, we forget that empires are massive and unwieldy things, and they can be used and manipulated by many different actors on the ground for many different purposes. I think you would refer to Namita Sugandhi's work at Tekkalakota. Tekkalakota is a site in southern India in the Deccan, not far from Mysore. And the evidence there, even though there's an Ashokan edict, suggests that the material culture didn't actually change a lot after the rise and the fall of the Mauryan Empire. So one of the many, many potential explanations for why we see Ashokan edict spreading is that there are a class of, again, local folks who are now seeing a new model of kingship and rulership emerging and are then seeking to associate themselves with it. Because clearly what Ashoka is doing, and something that is very clearly reflected in our own sometimes rosy-eyed historical view of him, is he's encapsulating and expressing a new way that an empire can be ruled. we know that up to this point in the Gangetic Plains, most kings ruled by absolute violence. If you were to read the Arthashastra, for example, in the first few chapters, there's a huge list of kings who are murdered in all kinds of grisly and gruesome ways. One of them is stabbed to death by his wife using a hairpin, that sort of thing. But very clearly, it's this almost anarchic world of political power. And Ashoka comes along and begins to wonder, given that I've inherited this sprawling, unwieldy regional confederation, how do I convince the people that I rule over that it's worth them participating in it? And Buddhism seems to have been one of the big ways in which he sought to justify and present himself not just as a victorious and warlike king, but more importantly, as a righteous king. And I just find that so interesting about him. Now, I can see that we're running out of time already, but there's still so much to discuss. So I'm going to request the Master of Ceremonies here to be a little indulgent with us, given that we are the last session for the day. Sushma, let's talk a little bit about historical memory, since that's something that has been touched upon so often, and Devika has also mentioned a number of later chroniclers who talk about the Mauryas. Now, in the 19th and 20th century, of course, you had a number of British scholars who are going across the length and breadth of India and who are collecting all these diverse sources of evidence. They're looking at the Greek sources, they're looking at Ashokan edicts, and they're trying to stitch together this image of an empire. But first of all, can you tell us a little bit about what was this image that was created of the Mauryas, and then how India's leaders in the lead up to and the decades immediately after independence built upon that? And then perhaps we can talk a little more generally about the question of, did Indians have a historical memory? Was it the case that the Mauryas had been completely forgotten? Were they remembered? By whom and for what reasons? So let's begin.
That's a lot of questions. I'm going to maybe tackle just one or two of those. But actually, you're right. I think the Mauryans, I mean, I wouldn't say they're entirely forgotten, because if you go back to the inscriptions, especially the pillars, they were recut, they were recarved with other inscriptions. Even there's one in Delhi, for example, that was moved. You know, there's even a beautiful painting showing how it was, taken down a river and then recarved. And Timur looked at another one. So they were always there. They were part of the landscape and they were part of kingship. But to just focus a little bit more on what you mentioned about the British in India, I think this is a really important point, because that is the moment when the Mauryans took on a very particular aspect, and it's the aspect that we still have now, except most of us don't realise it. So for the British historians of India, when you look at how they are remembered, and to look at Chandragupta in particular, it's this moment that he had this skirmish battle, whatever you want to call it, we don't actually know what happened, on the banks of the Indus between Alexander's general Seleucus and Chandragupta. Now, the sources do not tell us who won this skirmish, and that's the key point. That really is so important, because for the British, they thought, excellent, Seleucus crossed the Indus, gave Chandragupta a good kicking, whereas actually, at the moment when the fight for Indian independence began, it was the complete opposite story that was told by the Indian scholars. And for them, if you look at any of them, whether it's Mukherjee, Majumdar, these really great Indian historians, for them, if you read any of their works, it's the complete opposite. It was Chandragupta who repulsed the European foreigner Seleucus. And so you can see here, you've got the Indians standing in for contemporary India, and then you had Seleucus standing in for the British incursions. And you see all of that reflected in popular culture during the late 19th and early 20th century in particular, whether it's movies, whether it's plays, whether it's historical fiction. And something that surprised me the most when I was looking into this is that while the first painting installed in the Indian Parliament complex was of Mahatma Gandhi, and understandably so, the first ever sculpture to be installed was of Chandragupta. It's really extraordinary, but that way of understanding him, it's vital, because that's still how we see him, despite, as I mentioned, the historical sources for this figure are virtually non-existent. We know so little, but he's such a massive figure in our imagination because of the way the historical forces came out.
That's That's fascinating, Sushma. Could you actually tell us a little bit more about this sculpture? Because I just find it so interesting in how it's picked up all these legends of Chandragupta and expressed them in it's a metal sculpture, I believe.
It is. This is slightly random, but it turns out that the lady who has the office next door to mine at work, she's also a curator in prints and drawings. It turns out it was her great-grandma that made the sculpture, and it used to be in her garden in Wimbledon. And she wrote this book during the Second World War, and she got Rabindranath Tagore to write the foreword to this book. So she's very well connected. Her name was Hilda Seligman, and she created this particular sculpture. And it's not based on... If you look at the sculpture, it's not of this great big martial warrior. It's of Chandragupta as a young shepherd boy. And people are like, what, shepherd boy? What's going on? But when I mentioned those Sri Lankan chronicles, that's where she got the idea from. So she presents him as this young boy sitting cross-legged with a flute in his hand. And in the inscription underneath him, it's Chandragupta as a young shepherd boy dreaming of the India he was to create. Right? So once again, you have this other link between Indian independence and the Mauryan Empire and the founding of that. That sculpture, it's just absolutely fascinating. And it was wonderful because Hilda's grandson, Lincoln Seligman, is also a very famous artist. And he remembers seeing that sculpture in his grandmother's garden, and he shared that story with me as well. So it's when you embark on writing a book or any research, it's extraordinary what you find out. I had not anticipated that.
That's fascinating. And once again, it gives me a few threads I'd like to pick at, which is, and the first of them is this idea of Chandragupta as a shepherd boy. And I'm sure all of us in different formats, whether it's through poorly produced Hindi TV serials or through Amar Chitra Katha or a myriad of sources, have all heard of some or the other legends of Chandragupta Maurya. The one that I'm sure most of us have heard of is that the very first thing he did when he met Chanakya was rush off to fight the Nanda king, then got roundly kicked, went back and saw a woman scolding her child for eating a roti from the middle because it was hot instead of from the sides where it was colder. And that's what gave him the idea to slowly conquer the Nanda Empire from the outside and then move within. Now, there's so many other legends like this about the Mauryas that are told by so many different kinds of people. I know that, for example, I lived in Bangalore for a bit, and not far from Bangalore is Shravanabelagola, a major medieval Jain site. And there, Jains from the 8th or 9th century began to claim that Chandragupta Maurya had come there and ritually starved himself to death in the Jain ritual. Now, did he actually do that? The Jains claimed that he did, but why did they claim that? Clearly, there's some memory of him. There's some idea that there was this glorious king who ruled much of India, and they want to appropriate him to make their particular site seem more important. There's so many others like this. So, Devika, if you could take us through a few examples of historical memory using or reusing the Mauryas, Indian historical memory, and whether that tells us more about the Mauryas or the people who are making up these stories about them.
So there's always an element of truth in most stories. But I'm deliberately going to focus on a memory that involves a woman, because women are usually considered irrelevant to the historical reconstruction of the past. Therefore, I'm going to focus on them. And I just want to quickly mention here that, as Sushma said, Chandragupta did have female bodyguards, and there were very strong women associated with both Bindusara and Ashoka. Lots of stories around them, but we'll come to that later. So it's not as if Ashoka was completely forgotten and, we had to wait for the British to suddenly push him out of the shadows. He's always been in and out of legend and memory and truth and so on. And there's a very interesting inscription issued in the 12th century by a lady called Kumara Devi. It's called the Sarnath inscription of Kumara Devi of Kannauj. She was the wife of the king Govinda Chandra, the Gahadawala king of Kannauj. She's a Buddhist, and she mentions in her inscription, which is issued to commemorate a Buddhist temple that she makes, that she's following a faith that's different from that of her husband. But she says that she has restored a certain image of the Buddha there in a manner in which it would have been in the days of the great Ashoka. So she's actually clever enough to invoke the name of Ashoka to confer a measure of respectability on her inscription and her structure. So Ashoka is very much in the public memory in the 12th century, even before, when there were these Chinese pilgrims, Fahian and Huansang, that's 5th and 7th respectively. He's still there. They still, in fact, Huansang keeps bumping into Ashokan pillars wherever he traveled in the country, and he has fantastic stories related to them. But it's just interesting that people usually forget that there is this one evidence that connected with a woman that's usually routinely forgotten in reconstructions of Ashoka.
While we're on the subject of women and the Mauryas, one of the most colorful legends that's told about Ashoka, and I'd be delighted to debate whether there's a grain of truth in this at all or not, that this youngest queen of his supposedly had this malign influence over him at the very closing of his reign, and that's what led to the empire's collapse. If you could briefly tell us about that, Devika, and perhaps give us some closing remarks more generally about the way that we imagine women in Indian history before we open to audience questions.
So here's the thing about women in Indian history. They are not viewed in a very charitable light. And so whenever, and this is not just true of the Mauryas, but whenever any dynasty is coming to an end, usually historians scramble to find any woman who's connected with the ruler and say, oh my God, there's a woman, this empire is on its way out. Or the other way around, look, there is a woman on the scene, therefore this empire is on its way out. So yes, Ashoka had a series of very powerful queens. The last one, called Tishirashkshita, actually saved his life in a very colorful, dramatic way. I won't go into that here, we're running out of time. And then asks to be the ruler for a week, and Ashoka is granted, I've granted that wish to her, and then she does a lot of willful things. The second wife is supposed to have granted a lot of mango groves and orchards and so on to people and recorded it as her donation. And both these things are put together to form an image that Ashoka is losing control over his women, which means he is losing control over the empire. So, and then it doesn't help that the Mauryan Empire does actually collapse very quickly after that. That doesn't mean the two are connected. So it's just a word of caution here. We are talking about the Mauryas, but women did not always have a negative and destructive influence in every aspect of the past. They're also empire makers, they're powers behind the throne, and they were very strong in their own light. So I think we need to recognize that fact as well.
Thank you so much, Devika. So let's open the hall to questions. Let's take the young man in front here first.
So, Ashoka was a very great king. There's nothing that can be said against him. But there's a saying, nobody can be perfect. So what was the other sides? Not really the evil sides, but the things that he thought that he could improve to make him a better person by personality. So what were the evidences, what were the resources that have been gathered about that?
Devika?
Well, his edicts are the evidence. He says, as I said, he records his failure. There is no other contemporary surviving evidence of this. He needn't have done it. He won the battle, but he says, I've lost. Because it's because of me that so many people have been killed. And so he takes a step back at the height of his power and he says, I need to exercise restraint. I need to embrace another way of conquest, which is not violence. So he had the courage to do that.
So what Professor Rangachari is saying is that it's okay if you don't do well in all of your exams. It's completely fine. Just embrace it. In the back there? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to know a little more about Ashoka's rule in territories outside Magad, especially perhaps closer to the Indus and so on. So you sort of mentioned that the Mauryas saw themselves as emperors of Magad as opposed to emperors of the entire region. And yet there seems to be, was there any influence that Ashoka had in terms of spreading Buddhism to those areas? And if so, how did that sort of sit in with their own perception of themselves as being emperors of Magad? So I just wanted to know that.
Suresh?
If I heard the question correctly, I think it was about influence from the northwest.
I think we'll have to yell because the rain will drown us out otherwise.
So just very briefly about the northwestern. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So I think the question was about Northwestern influence. I mean, a lot has been written about this, and some accounts tend to exaggerate the Greco-Roman, not Roman, but rather the Greek influence that's creeping into the Mauryan court. But as Sushma alluded to earlier, a lot of this is speculative, right? The supposed marriage agreement that Strabo refers to, it's not specific enough for us to form a picture as to what kind of alliance this is. There may have been some kind of marital alliance between the Seleucids and the Mauryans, but that's not clear. The other thing that we should take into account is that the Seleucid household is not completely Greek. It's half Iranian. Seleucus was married to Apama, an Eastern Iranian woman. Right.
Thanks for that, Suresh.
Yeah, I have a question regarding post the Mauryan Empire.
The rain doesn't want you to know the truth about the Mauryas, so you'll have to be very loud.
Post the Mauryan Empire, in this series of invasion and conquest of India as a country, their edicts and inscriptions seem to have survived where most of others didn't. So in an attempt to subjugate a country, wouldn't you want to erode the fabric of nationhood, such as that of the great Mauryan Empire?
So I think the gentleman was asking about why was it that the edicts survived? Why did they survive? If it was a violent conquest, then how come people didn't go and rub out the edicts later on? Is that the question? Well, I couldn't hear the question with the mic, so I don't think we're going to hear it without it.
So, a brief so why wouldn't the Mughals destroy the edicts? Because that would erode the nationhood, right?
Why wouldn't the Mughals destroy the edicts? Who wants to take this? Why did the Mughals not destroy the Ashokan edicts?
The Ashokan edicts acquired different connotations over time. I mean, there was a point in which they were seen as being connected with Bhima of the Mahabharata, and known as Bhim ki Lat, or the stick of Bhima. Some of them were discovered in other contexts with vermilion on them, and they were converted into temples and so on. And let us not always assume that a part that supplants the other is always going to destroy, artifacts that belong to that particular, culture. Because people all through history had a keen sense of history, so to speak. So, they would have probably just kept it as something that they might not have completely understood, but something that was relevant to the culture they're supplanting. And that's why they honored it.
Well,
and that's why they survived.
In Allahabad...
This is the point, because actually in Delhi itself, there's a beautiful pillar that has survived virtually intact, which is just, oh my God, I can't remember exactly where it is, but you could drive by it on the way to the Red Fort, as I did just last month. But that was moved from one place to the other by one of the Delhi sultans, because it had implications on kingship. And so for him, it was a symbol of being a great ruler. Yes, they might not have known precisely what this Brahmi script meant, because knowledge of that had been lost. But as a symbol, it was clearly so important that it was worth expending the energy in moving it entirely intact to this new palace. So even when you go to the Gupta period, you have beautiful, the Prashti, for example, of Samudragupta, it's on an Ashokan pillar. So over time, yes, over millennia, they still retain that real important symbolism, because actually when you see them, they're extraordinary. This is not just some easy, quick thing to quickly, carve this brand new pillar and move it into place. It shows and speaks of power.
And if I'm not wrong, the pillar that you mentioned, which Samudragupta inscribed his message onto, also has an inscription by Jahangir, which I think answers the question. It's not necessarily that a new power seeks to supplant the old, but also to appropriate it. So thank you for that excellent question. The gentleman in the front, please.
So my question is for Devika and Sushma ma'am both. So both Nehru and Modi loves Ashoka in their own little way. So like the Nehruvian vision was like, on our national emblem and our national flag. Now we see that a new kind of an emblem on our parliament building, or the idea of the right that the original map of India was the Ashokan map or the Chandragupta map from Afghanistan till South India. So how do you see the Mauryas and Ashoka, their vision changing in the modern Indian thought, from Nehru to Modi and beyond? In the modern Indian history, how are the psyche and how are we responding to it as a society, and how do you see its future?
So I will just say this: the 4 lines of Ashoka, the Sarnath pillar capital, is our national emblem. But the Ashokan emblem, as it was conceived, shows the lions in a sort of dignity in repose or restraint. The repurposing of those lines nowadays show a kind of muscular, aggressive form, probably concomitant with the muscular, aggressive nationalism that is there today. So, you can, interpret it whichever way you wish.
Sushma, on post-independence ideas of the Mauryas in the Mauryan Empire.
Well, I think you have to go back to the tension between the British and the Indians in this lead up to independence, because even Nehru writes about Chandragupta as this great unifying figure of the unifying of India. And I think within that context, I'm not surprised that those symbols were chosen by the politicians of the time, and that it is linked with the parliament, and it is linked with the symbolism of the great nation building, because at that point, among historians, it was believed that this was the first and biggest early Indian empire. So as Chandragupta, the first, pan-Indian king, in the same way you have India, the first pan-Indian kind of nation state. So you can see that.
And it's something that happens in contemporary Europe in the 20th century as well, where you have the modern French nation, which is very much shaped by the medieval period, by being a Roman province and so on, going all the way back to the Celts and the Gauls and saying, no, that was the original French nation, we are exactly the same. History changes so much in those centuries that I think ultimately these ideas that the people of the past represented a kind of proto-nation says a lot more about our modern nations, of modern ideas of how we want history to be eternal, rather than the much more chaotic process that it actually is.
Just to follow on from what you just said, it's so important. It's such an important point, because as we've already talked about, the sources we have for the Mauryans are so limited, and yet every so often a new book on the Mauryans is written. We've all done it.
Thank you, Devika, and thank you to you all for joining us this evening. Thank you.